Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Closed New York City subway tunnels. Close to half a year ago, someone on /x/ posted a story about mole people. I was a lurker back then and did not contribute or post mainly out of concern for my identity. Yes, even in an anon board, people find ways to identify people. The thread had gained some notoriety in 404 at somewhere close to 250 posts. It was archived on 4chanarchive.org for quite some time before it eventually 404 as well. I'll do some digging. I may have the thread saved somewhere on this computer. If I find it, I'll post the thread in its entirety at the end of mine. Several years ago, I worked for the New York City Metropolitan Transportation Authority. Working for the custodial department is just as you would imagine it to be. A shitty job, but allowed for much more access to various places that normal civilians would not see. All under the guise of cleaning after the city, I was granted access to some of the deepest and darkest parts of the city. And believe me, cleaning up after New Yorkers is not an easy task. I haven't worked for the city department in ages, so I feel it's now somewhat safe to share my personal accounts and experiences. And let's not kid ourselves, I did not choose this profession. It was something I simply picked up. My past did not allow for such luxuries as working in an office or business environment. When I was younger, I hung out with the wrong crowds, did some bad things which eventually led me to where I was back then, a janitor of sorts. Any time from roughly 8 a.m. to about 3 a.m. the following morning, there are various cleaning staff traveling the subway systems, cleaning up after visitors and New Yorkers. From time to time, there would be requests for certain cleaning tasks at a specific station. But for the most part, a cleaner is designated to his or her station. I was mainly stationed by downtown Manhattan, which in my opinion was probably the dirtiest of all the stations. It's not mostly the adults that would leave a mess, but rather the kids. So either in the mornings when school started or when school ended, the kids from the nearby high schools and elementary schools would leave gum, spit, and whatever else behind, making a big mess. You'd think my main complaint was the hobos or the drunkards who pissed or defecated on the floors, but those aren't regular occurrences. For the most part, people acted civil. During the time between school hours, very little was asked of me. This allowed me to roam the tunnels or visit fellow workers in other stations. On a few occasions, we'd talk about the various encounters we had with hobos, catching a few sneaking into the subway stations and sometimes onto the tracks, or the odd places they managed to find shelter deep within the subway tunnels. The term we used was mole people. I'm not really sure who coined the term, but between 1994 to 1997, some lady by the name of Jennifer Toth wrote a book called The Mole People, and even before that, books and films depicted the notion of people living underground, either due to loss of jobs, homes, etc. In 96 or 97, there was a documentary that came out called Dark Days. It was mostly about homeless people being interviewed underground. As sanitation workers, we rarely spoke with the homeless. It was sort of an internal policy, because eventually they'd start asking for things, or making bizarre requests like staying the night in a particular area. They'd then leave a mess and we'd have to clean it up. Let's just say that the cleaning crew and the homeless were mostly at ends with each other. On a few occasions, we were assigned to abandoned stations to do cleanup. Considering the size of Manhattan and its history, there are estimated to be up to hundreds of various tracks that were either abandoned due to lack of funding or rerouted for more optimal routes. Believe it or not, Grand Central Station does in fact house a vast tunnel that once served as an escape route for various dignitaries. I've never been granted clearance to access it. However, I have cleaned up and worked with others in smaller abandoned tunnels and stations. The first encounter. Back in 1995, I was asked to join 3 fellow cleaning crews to clean up a station that was sandwiched between the 1 and the A train. You'd never see it from the trains, but it was definitely there. And what was surprising about the entire ordeal was that it was pretty well kept. Because of its location, the crew and I could not access the station via a train. We walked the tracks only after a coordinated meeting was held and conductors were informed not to take that specific track. As we got closer to the station, we all noticed it was kept in somewhat pristine condition, with the exception of dust and various molds that had sprouted from the walls. One worker had brought along a boombox so that we'd be able to listen to music while we worked, and surprisingly, the electric sockets were still running. We mopped, scrubbed, and dusted all that we could for the next 2 hours, when suddenly one of the female workers screamed in fear. Everyone rushed over to see what was happening. The look of fear on her face was something I had never seen or experienced before. She kept pointing into a dark, closed-off section of the station. She said, "I heard someone shout, 'Go away.'" The other 2 workers laughed it off as if it were a joke, but we all stood there in silence when a loud thud echoed from the darkness. We were all mortified when again, someone from the darkness shouted, "Go away." Michael, who was the person with the most seniority, immediately got on the walkie and requested assistance. We all just stood there paralyzed in fear. Not many people know this, but MTA has its own security team. They're there to serve and protect the people working in the MTA, but for the most part, they are the equivalent to RAC, rent-a-cops. For the next 30 minutes, everyone in the station stood in silence trying to comprehend how on earth someone could end up in an abandoned station. When the RAC arrived, he had his pistol drawn and entered the dark, chained-off section of the station. It seemed like minutes went by until he re-emerged with 2 people in handcuffs. The characteristics of these 2 people were almost impossible to describe. They were both dressed in what seemed like 60s attire, one of them a male who had suspenders and what appeared to be once a pinstripe trouser. His hair was so long that it masked his jawline where his beard was. The other, a woman who was wearing a dress so tattered that it was beyond recognition. They were both young, probably in their teens. The RAC said that he found these 2 hiding in the dark, staring at the exit as if they were expecting to attack when he spotted them. Needless to say, we left the station. Some internal investigation was put into excavating the area. Whatever was discovered was never disclosed to us. It was also around the same time that my 3 fellow co-workers were reassigned to LIRR, Long Island Railroad stations, so I hardly saw them again. There was a site a while back that actually documented a few of the hidden or forgotten underground tunnels of New York subways, but I can't seem to find it right now. I also can't seem to dig up the old Mole People thread that was archived a while back. If I find it, I'll post it. Keep in mind, New York City has a rather interesting history when it comes to subway tracks. New ones are built and forgotten and sometimes rerouted for optimization. So it's not implausible that there are stations that are left unattended and/or mismanaged. I've seen a few in my days, but there are certainly a lot more that I haven't seen. The second encounter. Not long after the incident, while all the people from the original cleaning crew were transferred to other stations, I continued working in Cortlandt Street Station. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's how the city was managed. No one brought up what had happened again, and neither did I. Least not with anyone who wasn't there. I did manage to meet up with Michael once or twice when I was crossing into Long Island from the city. We'd have lunch and talk about what had happened. Michael knew more than I did. Apparently his superiors put a hush-hush on the incident. No one was to talk about it with anyone. The 2 people that were found had no identification and there were no records of these people. Supposedly they were sent to some asylum somewhere. Something about being delusional and suffering from malnutrition and mental issues. I was told that it was best not to talk about it. Since dropping the subject, I really stopped talking to Michael. We didn't really have much in common and there wasn't really anything else to talk about. Working in Cortlandt Street Station had its perks. Mainly, I had the freedom to really roam around and get the lay of the land. I managed to figure out from the New York City Library that there were pictures and some forms of blueprints available for some of the older tracks. Having a loose schedule of which trains went where, I found myself the opportunity to do some tunnel exploring. Late one evening, I stepped onto the redacted station tracks and started walking, by all accounts. At least according to an old subway map, there should be an abandoned station that led to a longer, much narrower passageway that once served as a means to haul munitions and other various materials for the government. Armed with a flashlight, some paracord, a film camera, and a map, I managed to locate this corridor. I narrowly missed becoming another janitor's problem when one train passed me almost head-on. I figured it was only a matter of minutes before the conductor notified the station manager, so I figured the only way I'd be able to keep my shitty job was to haul ass and make a run for the passageway. Being a planner has its advantages. For one thing, I plotted out all the escape routes needed to exit the target site without being noticed. So I continued on my adventure and made my way through the passageway. One thing really bothered me, and it ate away at my mind as I ventured forth. The passageway was going down and only deeper. My biggest concern was whether or not I'd be able to make my way up and out if I continued. The flashlight worked wonders, but it was by no means a mag light. And as I went deeper into the tunnel, the darker spots of the passage increased. Several meters into the passageway, I started to hear sounds. For a moment, I stood there in silence trying to figure out what it was. I tried desperately to convince myself that the noises were rats chit-chatting amongst themselves. If ever I was more vulnerable in believing in a deity, it was then. What's strange is that after you go down a certain amount of depth, the noises stopped. At one point I was quite mystified that even the trains couldn't be heard. The further down I went, the hotter it got. Having brought a camera, I wanted to document what I had experienced and seen. But without a decent flash, most of the images came out blurry at best. It did, however, manage to scare away the half-dollar-sized roaches that were just about everywhere. Each time I flashed the camera, I'd hear loud hissing and see the roaches scurry in all sorts of directions. My boots were pretty much covered in sludge and roach corpses. But it became really hot, to the point where I had considered taking off my shirt. But the thought of roaches scurrying all over my body quickly discourages it. Further and further I went, until I started to hear what sounded like pots and pans clinking one another. It literally stopped me dead in my tracks as I tried to figure out what it was. But each subsequent step I took, the clinking would grow louder and louder. Suddenly I had realized I somehow managed to snag a line onto my backpack, and it was triggering the noise. I stopped to examine it when out of nowhere, I saw a shadowy figure almost glided right past me. The only way I could describe it was from some Japanese horror movie where the ghost passes behind the main character unbeknownst to him. It literally scared me to my core. That's when I hauled ass back where I had entered from. I eventually made my way onto some tracks, but they were definitely not from the street station. I had somehow ended up by Fulton Street Station, which was at the very least several blocks away from my entry point. When I got home, I tried to calm myself and try to recollect what had happened. The more I thought about it, the more I came to believe that I might have set off some primitive alert system. Set up by whom? I couldn't be sure. But the MTA definitely wouldn't use pots and pans to string an alarm of sorts. I've told no one of this story, only to a very few close friends and family.
I have a cousin that works for New York Con Edison, and he said they find people setting up camps in the New York Underground all the time. One group was in a remote section, and the people were pale as ghosts because they were in there so long without sunlight. They once found a group of urban explorers stumbling around with dead flashlights. Creepiest story was when he was alone in a section repairing an exchange. He hears mumbling in the distance. He looks over expecting to see a coworker with a light. Darkness. So he continues working. He hears it again a bit later, but it's closer. So he looks and yells, "Hello?" No answer. Darkness. So he goes back to work and is engrossed with the next part because there's a live wire. He's almost done when he hears the mumbling behind him and a cold hand touches his arm. He jumps up, and it's this homeless guy dressed in a tattered suit, wearing a tie, mumbling for money.
I was a weird kind of kid with no friends, and after spending a lot of time alone in Washington Square Park, eventually some homeless teens and adults started asking questions as they assumed I too was homeless. I cleared up the assumption and explained that no, I wasn't homeless, just a weird kid that enjoyed people watching in the park. I became friends with all of them rather quickly. They never judged me and watched out for me. Probably kept me safe from a lot of scarier dangers. But anyway, the season eventually changed to winter and it was cold in the park, so my dear friend Casper looked over and said something like, "Want to go meet some mole people?" I had no idea what he was even talking about, but readily agreed. Casper always led the best adventures, so we headed down to the train station at West 4th and took a train to a different station, got out, and walked to the end of a platform. After making sure it was all clear, we headed down the little steps and into the tunnel. Not gonna lie, I was sure I was gonna die, but I was content with the thought. I was a weird kid. But I didn't die. Instead, after what seemed like hours, we found ourselves in an area that was cleared out and lit with what I assumed was lanterns. There were all sorts of people, teens, adults, elderly, junkies, crazy people. But kind of like the other places they'd taken me to, there was an order to things. It was a weird experience. Didn't smell all too pleasant, but it wasn't crawling with bugs and rats either. There were no children that I saw, but someone did have a dog. It wasn't chaos and mayhem. They were just small groups of people with no place else to go in the cold, unforgiving city we call home. We hung out for a while like we like to do, and then we made our way back to the surface. It was a special experience for me, something I'll certainly never forget. Casper made me promise him I'd never try to go alone or bring anyone else to explore. I kept that promise and have never gone back.
Electrician friend did contract work for the MTA in the 90s when they integrated the NYPD radio system into the subway radio system. The initial batch of repeater amplifiers were faulty and would burn out deep in the tunnels, so he'd venture into the subterranean world to change them out. There, he said, he encountered dozens of homeless, many who lived in small makeshift villages and towns complete with salvaged refrigerators, radios and TVs powered by tapping into lighting wiring. They lived in abandoned tunnels, access tunnels and other less frequented places in the system. I asked him if they ever bothered him, and he said that they never bothered him or anyone he worked with. However, the real danger was the rats. He said, you couldn't stand still for more than a minute or two, otherwise they would crawl on you and nibble at leather boots. He carried a pellet gun around after the first few rat assaults. He didn't know how the mole people lived with them.
The wide railroad tunnel beneath Riverside Park is a dark and peaceful place. It suits the needs of its inhabitants, who number perhaps 100, and sometimes call themselves the Mole People. A neighboring group of squatters is called the Rotunda Gang because of their home beneath the park's traffic circle at 79th Street. The Rotunda Gang and the Mole People are generally middle-aged men who keep to themselves, although some live with girlfriends or share meals with neighbors. They spoke of past bouts with drugs or alcohol and mental illness, but most of those interviewed seemed sober and lucid. Some work at outside jobs, go to school, or survive on government checks mailed to churches or friends living nearby. Probably most are self-employed. They go off with shopping carts collecting scrap metal, cans, bottles, books, and magazines to sell on nearby streets or redeem at recycling centers. Despite their years in the tunnel, they still see it as a temporary address, a safer alternative to the city's shelters or the streets or the other shantytowns.
I used to work for Con Edison back in the 90s before I changed to sanitation. I had to change jobs because it was too freaky down there. New York City has hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles of tunnels, some of which go back all the way to the 1800s. We found all kinds of shit down there. Bodies, animals, a fucking bear once. Entire homeless cities with dozens of people living there. I've seen and heard the weirdest shit you couldn't imagine. I'll never go back down into the maintenance tunnels again after this one time. I was working on a route under the Lower East Side, right outside of downtown. It has one of the highest rates of shit-breaking going on down there because of all the businesses and huge homes and condos. They put such a tremendous strain on the system. There are constant fires and outages. We were really deep in the old tunnels where the walls are sandstone bricks from the early 1900s. Everything is brass, and the wires are covered in thick, heavy coating, almost like cardboard. At the time, all the main wires had not been replaced yet. I was pulling down a junction box with my buddy, and we both heard this low-pitched guttural sound, like a cat throwing up, but long like a growl. So we stop and look, because there are feral animals down there, and the rats are fucking huge. They're a serious threat. We turn and look down the corridor into the darkness, and there's this creature standing there at the turn, maybe 4 feet tall, extremely thin and gangly looking. Its eyes were bright orange in my headlamp. It was standing there in the corner just watching us, pacing back and forth and growling. My friend and I ran out of there so goddamn fast I tore my ankle slipping up the catwalk into the main tunnel. 2 months later, I transferred to sanitation with DSNY. Never looked back. I'm 61 now, about to retire. I'm planning to move out of New York into the rural area of Pennsylvania.
Can you tell us some more details about the creature? What color was it? Did it have hair? Did it have 2 legs or 4? And if it had 2, did it walk on them alone as it paced back and forth?
It was dark, so I couldn't see it very well. About 30 feet away, our headlamps were bright, but they weren't nearly as good as flashlights today. It appeared to have pale skin, kind of dingy looking, but that might be because it was so dirty down there. It had no clothes on, so it wasn't a person, or it was a crazy person. It was approximately 4 feet tall, extremely thin arms and legs, thinner than any human could ever be. No hair that I could see, but I didn't have time to really study it. It stood on 2 legs with its arms moving up and down like it was anxiety pacing, if that makes sense. If it was a person, it was a fucked up, mutated person, someone abandoned in the tunnels, and it was just down there surviving. But human eyes don't glow orange in direct light. Its eyes were huge on its face. I wish I was an artist, so I could draw it. This is probably the best I can do in MS Paint. I tried painting once doing Bob Ross stuff, but I was never any good. I only saw the creature for maybe 30 seconds.
Old school nearby that my mum used to go to when she was little. When I was around 9, they demolished it, but the canteen still stood. Just looked spooky standing there on its own. But then that got demolished when I was about 12 too. This one day when I was older, I was talking to my mum about school days and things. She mentions the old school and how spooky it was. There was the cellar basement kind of area that was just a long corridor with a storage room at the far end. Even the teacher was shit scared of the place and used to take my mum and her friend with her whenever she had to go down there. Always warned my mum and her friend not to go down there alone. To get to the corridor in the first place, you had to go down some steps. Then there was this big locked wooden door, then more steps, and then the corridor. This one day my mum and her friend walked past, and the door was open. So they went down for spoops. But this time they noticed there was another door in the corridor on the side, and it was unlocked. They opened it, and it was just a pitch-dark tunnel. I couldn't tell how far it went, but she said it was freezing cold. They get spooked and run back out. Tell the teacher. Teacher is furious and tells them the tunnel goes all over beneath the town, and they'd easily get lost in there. Naturally, I want to explore this shit, but the building is long gone and has been tarmacked over, so there's no chance. Fast forward about 15 years to a couple of years ago. Friend works at this building with the council that's at the other end of town. It's an old building too, and I'm not even sure what he does there. I'm not even sure if he knows himself. It's pretty big, but there's only about 4 people work in it, and nothing ever happens. One day a workman comes in and asks Friend if he can give him a hand. Sure. Goes with the workman to the cellar. Friend doesn't go in here usually because it's just boilers and shit. But at the far end there's a wall that's been half smashed down. That leads into this little room with a sort of steep ramp in one end. At the end of the ramp is an entrance about 4 foot high and 3 foot wide. He has to go in there with the workman. It's dark, but they have torches. Tells me it just splits off all over the place like a labyrinth. Workman tells him to stay close because he'll easily get lost. It's just chalk directions on the walls with arrows and things. He estimates they go about half a mile inside. He asks the workman what they're doing in there, and he tells him the council want it blocked off. But every corridor leads to a different building under the city. Everything from old shops and schools to banks and the town hall. Friend tells me he has the alarm codes for the building and the keys because, well, he works there. Asks me if I want to investigate the tunnels sometime. Absolutely. Few setbacks, but we eventually go. Half-smashed wall in the cellar is still half-smashed, it's just like he said. See the little steep ramp? Entrance at the top has already been filled in. Ask Friend what the building he works in was ever used for. It used to be a doctor's surgery. One day they were doing work on it and found this massive room, like one of those observation places where they cut up cadavers. Then there were lots of shower blocks and things, but that was about 10 years earlier. and they were long gone now. Did my own investigation. It was a doctor's surgery, but only one doctor worked there, and this place, for one doctor, is absolutely massive. My wait to investigate spooky town tunnels goes on, as does finding out what the purpose of the tunnels was ever for.
Urban explorer here, and indeed there is some weird shit down there. Homeless people are most common. Lone wolf or small groups of meth heads. Though entire homeless villages and cities can be found. Oh, and rarely even I have not seen it, but drug labs and shit, as long as smuggler dens in bigger cities by harbors. Actually, close to my home is Houston, and that place is riddled with homeless groups that spread out, all basically connected, and while meditating I thought of those locations and made contact with something. It may be paranoia, but there is something lurking in the larger, more dump-like areas with huge openings. Its appearance, from what I know, is like a black robe covering its whole body, and this single white mask covering God knows what, and I also seen like vermin like rats, roaches, and flies surrounding it. Searched for articles about, but could only find a Trevor Henderson monster that I cannot remember the name of. But yeah, this is kind of what the being looks like. I kinda just deemed him Bagman.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.